Hello, my name is Jim Lucas, and this video is going to include some discussion of Alma chapters 43 to 63 in the Book of Mormon, uh, the part of the Book of Mormon which is come to be known as the War chapters. Now, we begin here, though, with a picture of the Manhattan, New York LDS Temple. And this is our first image for two reasons. First reason is that the material in this video was originally put together as part of a Sunday school lesson when I was living in Manhattan. For many years, off and on, I had the blessing of serving as a Sunday school teacher in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And back in the COVID times, we had to resort to presenting Sunday school lessons by Zoom. And so the first attempt that I'd made to do this in cooperation with the Union Square First Ward was to discuss these parts of the Book of Mormon. It came off fairly well, I think, but it was not recorded. And subsequently, as we held more Zoom classes, they were recorded, and several of those are available on the For Zion YouTube channel if you're interested. But this first one was not. And so we have now come around to these same parts of the Book of Mormon again in the Come Follow Me study cycle of that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sponsors. And so I thought it'd be perhaps useful to people to record some of the thoughts that I had put together at that time on these chapters. There's another reason to begin with this particular image. As you can see, now this is the Manhattan LDS Temple has been closed for renovations. This is a pre-renovation photo. As you can see, unlike most other temples, which are surrounded by lovely grounds and lots of parking lots, the Manhattan, New York Temple is right hard in the middle of the city. You literally, if you look in the very middle of the image, you see a kind of an overhang and it's brightly lit. That's where the entrance to the temple is. It's you literally walk directly in off of this busy sidewalk, and you're in the temple. I don't know if they're going to change that configuration with the renovations, but that's how it was originally designed. Or when it was created, it was built into a pre-existing building that had been a stake center. So in any event, I hope maybe to make a, I don't know, perhaps strained analogy to this setting as we get to the end of the thoughts I'm going to share with you on this part of the Book of Alma in the Book of Mormon, and we'll see how that goes. So just to give a little bit more background on myself, besides the fact that I've been a Sunday school teacher off and on for many years. I recently moved away from New York City, now live in Utah, but I've continued to work on the Book of Mormon, and recently co-authored a book with Jonathan Neville called By Means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation to the Restoration. This is on the translation of the Book of Mormon, and it's I think it has some interesting things in it. We discuss how the Book of Mormon may have been translated. We have, I think, some interesting material on how the Lord prepared Joseph Smith to be a translator, and probably it's best known for advocating, advancing the argument, the controversial minority argument, that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were telling the truth when they repeatedly testified that the Book of Mormon was translated from the gold plates using the Jaredite Nephite interpreters, which came with the plates provided by the Lord for purposes of the translation, which came to be known as the Urim and Thummim. But that's not the topic of this video. So let's move on here. So, and talk about the war chapters. So, Alma chapters 43 to 63. The overall question of this video is why? Why did Mormon put these chapters in his record? So it's clear that they constitute a discrete subsection. You know, they're a unit. They're linked. They're separate from the rest of the book of Alma and the book of Helaman, which follows. And they are quite substantial. By actual page count, they constitute 16% of what we have of the actual Book of Mormon. In other words, the parts of the Book of Mormon written by Mormon himself, which would be Mosiah through Mormon chapter 7. And although Mormon did not describe them this way, they clearly are about a lot of warfare, and they have come to be referred to as the war chapters. Now, this is a little unusual because, of course, there's plenty of accounts of other wars in the broader Book of Mormon that we have. Yet these particular chapters stand out as being especially detailed, and they stand as a separate, discrete unit, as opposed to all of the other accounts of wars in the Book of Mormon. Another interesting facet of these chapters is that, of course, they portray mainly are focused on the military career of Captain Moroni. Now, that's also an odd choice by Mormon, because the Captain Moroni lived almost 500 years before Mormon. So to give us some context, if a modern American were to write something and say, I'm going to use an example of some warfare to draw some moral lessons and teach some important doctrine and so forth, it would be as though that modern American were then to turn around, and they wouldn't talk about the Iraq War, they wouldn't talk about the Vietnam War, they wouldn't talk about the Gulf War, they wouldn't talk about the Korean War, they wouldn't talk about World War II, they wouldn't talk about World War I, they wouldn't talk about the Spanish-American War, they wouldn't talk about the the American Civil War. They wouldn't talk about the Mexican-American War. They wouldn't talk about the War of 1812. They would not talk about the American Revolutionary Wars. They wouldn't talk about the French and Indian Wars. They wouldn't talk about the wars of the Austrian Succession. They wouldn't talk about the English Civil Wars or the Glorious Revolution. No, it would be as though Captain Moroni was as distant in time from Mormon as we are from Queen Elizabeth I of England. So it would be as though a writer would be coming to us and say, I'm going to give you a detailed account and explore the moral dimensions and so forth of the wars of the Spanish Armada in the times of Queen Elizabeth I. That's it. We're going to forget about all the wars that happened since then. So this is, ending. And it's as I said, there's plenty of other wars discussed in the Book of Mormon, including Mormon's own wars. I mean, he spent his entire lifetime as the commander of the Nephite armies in his times. So, but he doesn't talk hardly at all about his own military career or campaigns, which is again unusual. Usually, when a general is writing histories of war, he talks about the wars that he led. But no, we don't hear that from Mormon. Instead, he goes back hundreds of years to detail the campaigns of Captain Moroni. So here's some questions to think about as we're going through this discussion. Why does Mormon reach back hundreds of years into Nephite history to give such a detailed attention to the career of Captain Moroni, especially compared with the fact that there are numerous other wars, and I'm sure Mormon had records of numerous other commanders of Nephite armies, including himself. Now, another question is, clearly these chapters have much to tell us about the moral dimensions of warfare, government, politics. These chapters are full of all kinds of discussion on these subjects. But more broadly, I would argue that these chapters are about conflict. That's it. They are jam-packed, chapter 43 right through chapter 63, with conflict. And so I think we can ask ourselves, even if we are not personally engaged in warfare, we certainly all have different kinds of conflicts in our lives. And so it would be a useful question to say, how does what we learn from these chapters relate to how we deal with conflicts of all sorts in our lives? Another question is, up until this point in the book of Alma, Mormon has been telling us about important doctrinal matters and the proselyting efforts of Alma the Younger and his colleagues, the sons of Mosiah. And then suddenly, and then we have the, and then we have doctrinal chapters in the 30s, the chapters 30, where, we're getting important doctrinal lessons that Alma is teaching to his sons. And then suddenly we have this shift to, from, chapter 42 to chapter 43 to this detailed, lengthy account of warfare, politics, and conflict. So is there, how does this make sense as from just a literary point of view? Does do the war chapters have any connection to what we've been reading previously in the book of Alma? How does this all fit together as a single book of the Book of Mormon? Finally, these chapters present in the starkest way some of the biggest questions about Mormon's book. According to Moroni's son, according to Mormon's son Moroni, on the title page, his father's purpose was the convincing the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ. Yet, if in Mormon's book were reduced to just prophecies of Christ and just the doctrine of Christ directly related to Christ and his visit to the Americas and so forth, the Book of Mormon would probably barely have a fifth of its current length. So instead, it's full of tons of other not doctrinal material. It's full of wars, politics, economics, political and economic commentary, legal matters, customs and mores, and most intriguing, or to me, it gives the records of the bad guys. The antagonists are quoted at length in their own original words. Now, how does all of this other stuff, all of this politics and war and economics and social descriptions of the society and so forth, what does that have to do with coming to Christ? So these are all questions which maybe we hope to touch on here in our short discussion, just to keep in mind. Okay, so the war chapters begin, of course, they center around Captain Moroni, who, and we meet him at the beginning of the war chapters here. And clearly, Captain Moroni is Mormon's personal hero. I mean, among other things, he names his son after him. And if we look at the Book of Mormon, again, remember, Captain Moroni precedes Mormon by 400 to 500 years. So this is like halfway back into the middle of Nephite history that Mormon is reaching to pull this particular story, and put it into such a position of prominence in his record. And of course, the most signal, evidence of the high regard that Mormon held for Captain Moroni is that Mormon named his own son after him. And if we look at the Book of Mormon, from the time of Captain Moroni to the time of Mormon, we see that there's lots of personal names that are given, and Moroni never appears. So this is not a common name in the Nephite society of Mormon's time. And it would be sort of like if someone today were to, name their son Algernon, or something like that, or Abraham. Clearly, it was not a common name, and it was a very deliberate decision on Mormon's part to name his son and heir after this hero of his from hundreds of years before in Nephite history. And, Mormon describes his hero here in chapter 48, verse 17, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have had power over the hearts of the children of men. I praise indeed. And he goes on to describe Moroni, since Moroni is a military man, as was Mormon, obviously, probably part of Mormon's attraction and interest in the story of Captain Moroni it stems from the fact that they had the same career. They held the same position essentially as head of the Nephite armies. And but he makes a point here that they were sorry to take up arms against the Lamanites because they did not delight in the shedding of blood. Yea, this was not all. They were sorry to be the means of sending so many of their brethren. Note that he's calling the Lamanites their brethren. We'll get to that later. Out of this world into an eternal world unprepared to meet their God. So this is Mormon's description of his hero, Captain Moroni, who we're going to learn a lot more about in these chapters. So, we have an example fairly early on here of Captain Moroni's moral conduct, even in the midst of battle. So this is in chapters 44 and 43, 43 and 44. In 43, we have an instance where they're having a battle with the Lamanites, and the Lamanite commander's name is Zarahemnah. And they press the Nephites, the Lamanites. The Lamanites are losing the battle, and they come to a point where they're on the verge of capturing, or they have captured, Zarahemnah. And Moroni, Captain Moroni, calls a halt to the battle. In many ways of military thinking, once you've got the commander of the other side, you kill him, and that often will end the battle, as the loss of the commanding general discourages and causes the enemy troops to become disorganized. But instead, here Moroni calls a halt to the battle, and he enters into a discussion in the middle of the battlefield with Zarahemnah. And he says here in chapter 44, verse 6, I command you by all the desires which we have for life. This is Moroni's values life, that if you will deliver up your weapons of war, we will not seek your blood, but will spare your lives, if you will agree not to come against us again. So basically he's saying, we'll stop the bloodshed, you can withdraw, and as long as you kind of take an oath that you won't attack us again, you can get away and there won't be any more casualties, and we won't take any vengeance against you. And interestingly, Zarahemnah, and again, this is one of many places where the Mormon gives us the antagonists in their own words. And so he records here that Zarahemnah's reply was, we are not of your faith. We do not believe that is God that has delivered us into your hands, but instead is your cunning. in that you have had breastplates and shields. What Captain Moroni had done was he had equipped his troops with some body armor, and the Lamanites didn't have that, and that had given them the Nephites an advantage in this battle. And so he says, that's what preserved you, and I'm not going to enter into any kind of oath. And then verse 10, there it says, and when he had finished speaking, Moroni turns his weapons back, gives his weapons back to him, and says, behold, we will end the conflict. So they continue the battle, but Captain Moroni gives the Lamanite commander his weapons back so he can fight honorably. So this is an interesting man, Captain Moroni, as Mormon describes him. Now, Mormon's description of Captain Moroni, however, is not a glorified, whitewashed, man on a pedestal figure. And we can see this in this incident that we've just been looking at in chapter 44. So he goes on, Mormon in his description, to now say here in verse 17, and now Moroni was angry because of the stubbornness of the Lamanites, and therefore he commanded his people that they should fall upon them and slay them. So this was not just a situation where, Captain Moroni is being all dignified and honorable and so forth. No, he does give Zarahemna his weapons back so he can fight with honor, but Moroni is very upset, and they move in, and there are many more Lamanite casualties, and they are very definitively defeated with great loss of men and life, including Zarahemna, because of their refusal to accept Captain Moroni's offer of terms for surrender and withdrawal. And this is an interesting aspect of Mormon's description. Captain Moroni has got a temper. He has got a temper. And this is one instance of it. And in fact, Mormon portrays Captain Moroni's temper again and again and again. Here we cite a few more examples of how Mormon gives an honest portrayal of his hero. He doesn't portray him as a mild-mannered, sweet, righteous, spiritual man. No, Captain Moroni's got a temper, and it's a short temper, and he lets go with it regularly throughout the account. So here's a few verses here in chapter 46:11. When he's dealing with another Lamanite commander named Amalickiah, he says he was angry with Amalickiah. Amalickiah is a Nephite dissenter. Later, toward the end of the war chapters, in an incident which we'll discuss in more detail a little bit later, in chapter 59, he says that Moroni was angry with the government. This is his own government that he's an official of. And in chapter 54, verse 7, he's writing to another Lamanite commander, and he says to him, I would tell you concerning that awful hell that awaits to receive such murderers as thou and thy brother have been. And then a little bit later in the same chapter, this is in an epistle that he's writing to the Lamanite commanders, he says, thou art a child of hell. Now, to put this into context, this is an epistle which Captain Moroni is sending to the Lamanite commanders to try to negotiate a prisoner exchange. So, I don't know, let's just put it this way, that Captain Moroni, not only did he have a short temper, but he was not very diplomatic, and to say the least. Because when you're trying to negotiate with somebody, I don't know if calling them a child of hell is perhaps the most politic way to approach the negotiations. But nonetheless, Mormon honestly portrays, his hero's faults as well as his virtues. Here's another example in Alma chapter 60, and I headed this with what if Captain Moroni was on Twitter? So, in the war chapters, Mormon quotes at length from epistles to and from Moroni. Now, Moroni is dictating this to a scribe who's then going to run the thing off. But nonetheless, you can picture Captain Moroni, pacing back and forth, angrily dictating to his scribe. And my thought is, just imagine what it would be like if somebody with Captain Moroni's temper was posting on Twitter, or X as it's called today, and didn't even have a few minutes of time to wait and think about what he was writing. But he just let loose. So this is a letter from Moroni to the central government that he's an officer of and that he serves. And he says to them, "Can you sit upon your thrones in a state of thoughtless stupor? We know not but what you are also traitors to your country." And he's complaining here about not getting adequate reinforcements and supplies, a great classic complaint of all military men. "Ye have neglected us because you're in the heart of our country, and ye are surrounded by security. Behold, I will stir up your..." So he's threatening, he's telling the government, "Behold, I will stir up insurrections among you." He's telling them it's because of your iniquity that we have suffered so much loss, because they've, haven't been sending him the reinforcements and supplies that he needs. And he ends saying, "The sword of justice doth hang over you, and it shall fall upon you and visit you even to your utter destruction." This is a hot-headed, short-tempered, not very diplomatic man. And Mormon plainly and honestly portrays his great hero, these characteristics of them. So this is now continuing the same incident that's portrayed toward the end of the war chapters. This is now so that's an epistle that Captain Moroni sends to the central government, which is the head governor of the Nephites, is a man named Pahoran. And so that's chapter 60. And then in chapter 61, we get Pahoran's response. Now, Captain Moroni may have been Mormon's model Christian warrior, but Mormon also gives us Pahoran, who I think is the model Christian politician. So this is what Pahoran, so he gets this angry letter from Moroni threatening to come and basically overthrow the government if they don't come through with the kinds of reinforcements and supplies that Captain Moroni feels that he needs in order to press this defensive war that he's in charge of and responsible for to defend the Nephite nation. And remember, those are not idle threats. Captain Moroni has an army. So these are, this is not just somebody spouting off. This is a man with an army making these threats. So this is what Pahoran responds. He says, "I do not joy in your great afflictions. Yea, it grieves my soul," he says. "I am not angry," if you look at verse 9 here, "but I do rejoice in the greatness of your heart. I, Pahoran, do not seek power, save only to retain my judgment seat, that I might preserve the rights and liberties of my people." So he doesn't respond angrily to Moroni's very angry epistle. Instead, he's diplomatic, he's calming, he's charitable, he's understanding, and he goes on, "My soul standeth fast in the liberty which the Lord God hath hath made us free. And in fact, he then goes on to explain that in fact, there's been the reason he hasn't been able to send supplies and reinforcements to Captain Moroni is because there has been a rebellion in the Nephite central lands, and that has he himself, Pahoran, has had to flee from Zarahemla, and that's the reason. And he explains this and suggests instead that Captain Moroni indeed come and join forces with the people who were with Pahoran so that they can take back control of the government that had been had a coup to overthrow it. And it's interesting. So Captain Moroni does that, but he doesn't actually ever really apologize to Pahoran. So anyway, but this is a man. He's showing Pahoran as being a person who is exercising patience, long-suffering, and understanding and charity in carrying out his own very difficult political duties. And Mormon clearly portrays him as such, and kind of leaves his own hero, Captain Moroni, kind of looking kind of the worst out of this exchange. Now, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, one of the features of the war chapters is that it's not just about the wars with the Lamanites. Throughout the war chapters, there is clearly a section of the Nephite society which is opposed to this. It's probably inaccurate to call the Nephite government democratic, but they are under the rule of judges who are elected by the voice of the people. Now, sort of the positions tend to be quasi-hereditary, so it's not really proper to analogize it to modern democratic governments that we know in our world today. But nonetheless, for the ancient times, this is a pretty popular kind of government that was set up after the royal line ran out, after the sons of Mosiah went off to do missionary work instead of assuming the throne from King Mosiah II. So any case, but it's clear that there is a lot of dissent, in particular from a group that's called the King Men, and this is people from the upper classes of Nephite society, and they are constantly dissenting, and they're in communication with the Lamanites. So this is not just a matter of polite, a loyal opposition. No, they're a disloyal opposition. They are talking to the enemy, and they are seeking to overthrow the government and to, return this sort of quasi, at least popular kind of government that has been established among Nephites, and reestablish some kind of a monarchy, an aristocratic government. Because like I said, these dissenters seem to be coming from the upper classes of Nephite society. So these are really difficult circumstances for a person in Captain Moroni's position. And so he has to deal with this, as we saw. So this is Alma chapter 51. This is earlier than the one we just saw with Pahoran. So this is a continuous thing. There were several of these attempted coups and rebellions in the course of while the Nephites were fighting this desperate existential war for their survival against the Lamanites, who, by the way, were almost always led by Nephite dissidents or dissenters. It wasn't spontaneous or an effort that just rose up out of the existing Lamanite society. They only engaged in this warfare because the Nephite dissenters came over and were able to infiltrate and take over the Lamanite government. Any event, Mormon shows us this is, he doesn't sugarcoat this. This is a tough situation. So we see here in Alma chapter 51, where Mormon describes, like in chapter 17, that Captain Moroni has to pull troops off of the front lines and go back to deal with these dissenters who are attempting to carry out a coup d'etat against the Nephite elected government, these kingmen, and he has to fight them. And indeed, in chapter 19, or not chapter 19, verse 19 here, he has 4,000 of them are killed. And I note here at the very end that they were these actions were carried out because there was no time for their trials at this period. In other words, this is, even though the Nephite society has kind of a judicial system and has some sort of a rudimentary rule of law, these circumstances are so difficult and so pressing that Captain Moroni feels that he has to carry out these actions without going through the legal processes that existed in the Nephite society and government. Now, people argue, Latter-day Saints today, I have seen arguments about whether, it was appropriate for Captain Moroni to violate the civil liberties of these dissenters and, violate them to the extent of killing them. The point I would make, I don't want to get into sidetracked on that argument, but my point is that these are hard cases. This is hard situations. This isn't, the whitewashed and sugar-coated version of history. Mormon is giving us hard history here with the real things, the way they really happen in history, where there's real dissension, there's real treason, there's real danger to the civil government. Mormon shows us Captain Moroni not only as a great general, but also trying in the worst circumstances to preserve freedom given by the Nephite nation's tradition of the rule of law. So we all love the beginning of the war chapters, where we have this great incident where Captain Moroni raises the title of liberty. And what did he write on the title of liberty? He says, "In memory of our God, our religion, our freedom, our peace, our wives, and our children." That was his rallying cry. So he was trying to preserve the traditions of rule of law, freedom of religion, and peaceful, existence that had grown up in the Nephite nation. That was what Captain Moroni stood for. But it's not easy. It's not easy. Circumstances of real history do not always allow that. For example, near the end of the war chapters, they're still having dissensions. This party of kingmen continues even after they've been suppressed several times by the civil government and Captain Moroni and the military forces are still trying to overcome the civil government, the sort of quasi-democratic government that the Nephites had. And so here again, chapter 62, right at the end of the war chapters, Pacus was the leader of these dissenters who were trying to, or dissidents who were trying to engage in a coup and overthrow the Nephite government. And so Captain Moroni has to come, takes them and casts them into prison, and executing them according to the law. So at this particular point, unlike the previous example, there is time, and Captain Moroni does follow the legal procedures that existed in the Nephite government at that time, but he does carry out these, still harsh measures in order to preserve the liberty of the Nephite nation. And again, I'm sure that if we had Pacus amongst us, he would have a different argument about how, Captain Moroni was, a military dictator, and that, Pacus should have been the rightful king of the Nephites, and, Captain Moroni was this, populist, Democrat who, was overthrowing the rightful order of the Nephite society and so forth. These are all the kinds of issues that Mormon describes in his account in these chapters. Now, here's still yet again another aspect of Mormon's writing that I find intriguing, and that is that, so he's working with the records, and mostly he's abridging them. So we're hearing Mormon's words as he kind of abridges and summarizes the history. But particularly in the war chapters, and he does this like, for example, previously in the book of Alma, we've heard many great discourses, and that Alma, King Mosiah has done, King Benjamin has done, that Alma the Younger has given. So, Mormon, likes to quote original sources where it's appropriate. But in addition to prophets and so forth that he's quoting, another thing that he quotes are the bad guys. He has in his records, apparently, the original documents from epistles that were sent to the Nephites by their various antagonists. In this case, it's the Lamanites. Later on, we will see correspondence quoted in full by Mormon from the Gadianton robbers, the leaders of the Gadianton robbers. So this is something that Mormon does throughout his record, is to quote from the bad guys and let us see their views in their own words. So Alma 54 is an example of that. He is now there's a new Lamanite commander named Amaron, and the Captain Moroni has sent him a message to try to have some negotiations, and this is a direct. Mormon is giving us a direct quote from the archives of the epistle that they received back from the Lamanite commander Amaron. And notice, I just to give a little flavor here, look at verses 23 and 24. He declares, "I am Amaron, a descendant of Zoram, whom your fathers oppressed and brought out of Jerusalem." So a little bit different version of the story that we read in First Nephi. Mormon doesn't rebut it. He just says, okay, that's how the Zoramites, or some of the Zoramite descendants, look back at the history. And then he says, "And behold, I am a bold Lamanite. Behold, this war was waged to avenge the wrongs that the Nephites had committed against the Lamanites' ancestors." This is in the Lamanite commander, in his own words, quoted directly without commentary from Mormon. He just says, okay, I'm going to show you what the other guys had to say. And just to put this in context, imagine if today we were writing a history of World War II, and the historian said, you know what, I'm going to put some quotes in here from Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf, so you can kind of understand the Nazi point of view. We wouldn't do that today, and yet Mormon so wants us to understand the full historical context of the events that he's describing to us, that he includes these quotations from the original sources from the other side's point of view. So, and that's not all. So as we go on, of course, the center of the war chapters is Captain Moroni, who, is the model Christian warrior. And clearly, a man who is personally a great example and a great hero to Mormon. But Mormon also gives extensively description of other people in these chapters. And most amazing is the story of the people of Ammon, the anti-Nephi-Lehis, which Mormon devotes a great deal of space in this section on his history to describing the story of the anti-Nephi-Lehis who become known as the people of Ammon. And of course, these are they're the exact opposite of Captain Moroni. Well, they're not the exact opposite in that both are governed by righteous desires, but they carry them out in very different ways. Captain Moroni is the righteous model Christian warrior defending his people. The anti-Nephi-Lehis, their approach is nonviolence, and they are the model Christian pacifists. And of course, they take an oath not to take up arms, and when the Lamanites start to slay them, they accept to be slain rather than take up arms to defend themselves. So that's the exact sort of opposite approach to Nephite and to Captain Moroni and the Nephite armies. And yet, and the fascinating thing, if you to look at these accounts, is that Mormon describes them both kind of fairly and completely, and he doesn't give his opinion as to which is the better choice. He just tells us the stories, lays them out in full, fairly, in detail, and leaves it at that. He does not have a conclusion to say, oh, the anti-Nephi-Lehis were, they were not practical, we can't really follow their example. Or he doesn't say, Captain Moroni should have been more like an anti-Lehi Nephite, because obviously the anti-Nephi-Lehis show that the Lamanites were susceptible to a righteous example instead of being, killed in battle. Now, who knows? Both arguments can be made. Mormon tells us the stories and then leaves it there. Now, the story, just to show how critical or central the story of the anti-Nephi-Lehis is the Reverend Professor Christopher John Thomas is a professor at the leading Pentecostal seminary in the United States, the leading school for training Pentecostal pastors. And he wrote a fascinating book, I highly recommend it, called A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. And he was noticing it, as we all do, that there's a lot of war in the Book of Mormon. But when he came to the story of the anti-Nephi-Lehis, he was very struck by it, found it to be a very powerful story. And he noticed, which no LDS scholar had noticed before, but that the story of the anti-Nephi-Lehis is the exact center of the Book of Mormon. In other words, by page count and even by word count. Chris contacted friends he'd made at BYU and said, you've got word counts. Where does this story fit in both in word count in the Book of Mormon? And it is the exact center of the Book of Mormon. Now, we can make of that what you want, but one interpretation here is that this is Mormon just telling us subtly that this is a very important story. And of course, it doesn't end there. We go on to hear the story of the Ammonites' sons who, joined the Nephite army toward the end. This is chapter 57, to try to help defend the Nephites who have given refuge to the Ammonites when they converted to the gospel and fled from the Lamanites. But again, so Mormon quotes in full a epistle from Helaman, who is describing this incident. So again, this is a very important incident. Now we, of course, we love the Stripling Warriors. It's a fun story. You got T-shirts with Stripling Warriors on them, and everybody loves the story of the Stripling Warriors. But if you look at Mormon's account of the Stripling Warriors, or as where he's quoting in full from the original sources, the epistle that Helaman wrote, you kind of get a different story. This is not blood and glory. Instead, you have Helaman describing this incident, and the fact is that although they were all wounded, there were no deaths amongst the Stripling Warriors. And this is how Helaman describes it, who is a subgeneral. He's also a prophet, but he's serving as a second in command to he's on the Western Front, and Captain Moroni's on the Eastern Front. Either that or it's the other way around. So anyway, he's the commanding general of the armies, a commanding general in the armies, as well as serving as a religious leader. But he writes here how, to our great astonishment, and also the joy of our whole army, they saw that there was not one soul of them that did perish. And then he continues, now their preservation was astonishing to our whole army. So I look at this and I say, this is not, again, a fun story. Mormon is not presenting this as a fun story. He's presenting this from the point of view of Helaman and his grizzled, hard-bitten, veteran warriors who are just dumbstruck by this incident, and by the fact that none of the young Ammonites died, even though they were all wounded, and showed great courage in battle. This is a story that's being portrayed from the point of view of grizzled, hardened veterans of war, not a kind of a fun, teenage romance. But that's Mormon. That's how Mormon presents it. So now to just take quickly a larger perspective here. So I raised the question before, how is it that these chapters fit with what's come before in the book of Alma, where we have these great doctrinal discourses and the dramatic missionary, efforts of Alma the Younger and the sons of Mosiah and so forth. They don't seem to be, that they belong in the same book. But I would argue that, in fact, what we're doing here, or what Mormon is doing here, is presenting two very different kinds of heroes. Alma the Younger, who first of all has a dramatic conversion, and then his and his friends' approach is to preach the gospel to their enemies. And then you have Captain Moroni, who tries hard, just abhors bloodshed and tries to negotiate and minimize casualties, but who nonetheless, is willing to kill his enemies if he has to, rather than preach to them. Now, again, Mormon presents both as heroic figures. He presents both Alma the Younger and Captain Moroni as admirable figures. And he doesn't opine as to which is better. He just fully and dramatically and very effectively presents us with the stories of these two very contrasting figures of heroic, righteous heroes. And just to make a little sidetrack here, to understand, to put this in the broader context, because after all, Alma the Younger and the sons of Mosiah, they are, close in time contemporaries. They're just before the time of Captain Moroni. So this is, the Alma the Younger is coming out of basically the same society that Captain Moroni is coming out of. And so when the Alma the Younger and the princes, the sons of King Mosiah, declare that they're going to go off and preach the gospel to the Lamanites, this is fascinating. And again, this is Mormon giving us this information. If you read in Alma 26, this is after they've come back from their missions, and Ammon is actually the narrator here. He describes the reaction of the Nephites when the royal princes and the son of the presiding high priest declare that they're going to go off into the Lamanite lands to preach the gospel. And he said, they said to us, they laughed us to scorn. This is verse 23. The Nephites laughed us to scorn, for they said, do you suppose that you can bring the Lamanites to a knowledge of the truth? Do you suppose that you can convince the Lamanites of the incorrectness of the traditions of their fathers, as stiff-necked people as they are, whose hearts delight in the shedding of blood and whose days are spent in the grossest iniquity? This is the reaction of Nephites. This is the view Nephites had of Lamanites, whose ways have been the ways of transgressors from the beginning. And verse 25, moreover, did they say, no, let us take up arms against them, that we may destroy them in their iniquity out of the land, lest they overrun and destroy us. So this is Nephite society as it existed at this time, and they were saying to the royal princes and to Alma the Younger, no, these Lamanites they're terrible, they're gross, they're evil. They're better off dead. We're better off fighting them than we are to, it's ridiculous. You're ridiculous thinking that you're going to go and convert Lamanites to the gospel. And of course, as Mormon shows us, in fact, they are, at least many Lamanites are, in fact, open to hearing the gospel message. So this is fascinating. This is a side issue, but one of the complaints against the Book of Mormon as a whole is that it has, especially in the Nephi, in the beginning parts, it has it has stuff that can be interpreted as racial prejudice against the Lamanites. But when you get into Mormon's book, this is fascinating. This is Mormon plainly showing us the anti-Lamanite prejudice of his own people. And what he does here is, it's very subtle what he does, but it's very obvious when you look at the Mormon's book as a whole. He doesn't, denounce the prejudice of his people. There's no lectures. Oh, this is terrible. Nephites are so prejudiced against the Lamanites. Instead, what Mormon does in his book is basically just show us example of righteous Lamanite after righteous Lamanite after righteous Lamanite after righteous Lamanite. So, and this is a powerful narrative strategy for, if you're looking at this from a literary point of view. He doesn't tell us, he shows us. That's what Mormon does here. So anyway, but that's not directly the issue of our little discussion here. But again, it's another example of how subtle and realistic Mormon is in grappling directly with real problems, prejudice, real social prejudice, the way it really exists in human society in all times of history. So, conclusion. What do we see then? What has Mormon given us in these war chapters, and with some extension, the previous parts of the Book of Alma? So we get a Captain Moroni who is a regular guy. He's got a short temper. He's not very diplomatic. We don't hear anything about Captain Moroni's religious views. We know that he's a believer, but he doesn't have visions. He doesn't preach any sermons. But he's loyal. He is righteous, and he has a steady faith in Christ in very, very difficult circumstances, which Mormon describes to us in excruciating detail. Captain Moroni has to deal with hardship, with bitter, years of warfare, dissension and treason, and attempted coups amongst his own people. He's stabbed in the front by the Lamanites, and he's stabbed in the back by his own people. So in the midst of all these circumstances, our kind of regular guy, Captain Moroni, not the guy who gives great sermons and so forth, but who can give a good, rallying speech when he needs to. But he's steady and he's true and he believes in Christ. But we get the other examples that Mormon gives us. We have Alma the Younger. We have Papa Horon, the model Christian politician. And we have, of course, the Ammonite parents and sons, who the model Christian pacifists, who will sacrifice their own lives rather than take up arms. And we have the story of their sons, who, probably were underage, but nonetheless wanted to go and do their part to defend the people who defended them, and who rely on the faith of their parents to survive this ordeal that they are subjected to. So basically, what we find here, at least as I can see it, is real life examples of various ways to live as a Christian, all told by Mormon. Again, he doesn't lecture us. He doesn't give us sermons. He doesn't give extended commentary. He'll interject some commentary every now and then, but not very much, especially to draw lessons. And he doesn't tell us. He shows us, like the great writer that he is. He doesn't tell us. He shows us many different ways of living as a Christian in the face of the greatest possible challenges that we can face. So to draw my analogy, our LDS Manhattan Temple sits in the middle of the big city, right in the middle of the big city, full of conflict, full of all sorts of pressures and contentions and so forth. But it sits in the middle as a monument to Christ, and we have had an angel Moroni on the top there as well, to symbolize the message of the gospel right in the middle of the hardest, most congestion, most confusing, most difficult, most contentious possible circumstances. That's what I see Mormon doing in the entirety of the book that he has given us, but in particular in these war chapters. He's giving us many different examples of Christian lives facing the most difficult challenges possible. I consider Mormon, Son of Mormon, to be one of the greatest writers in Christian history, if not the greatest. What other Christian writer, instead of preaching or theologizing or doctrinizing or so forth, instead gives us stories? He gives us stories of real life. He gives us stories of hard life. He gives us stories that aren't sugar-coated. He gives us stories that are not whitewashed. He shows us real life Christians with all their faults, facing real life challenges in all their terror, and how it is that we can live as Christians in a fallen world full of hard choices. How it is that we can live as the Lord taught us, as not just declaring doctrine, declaring belief in Christ that gets us in the kingdom of heaven, but doing the will of my Father who's in heaven. And that is what I see Mormon, son of Mormon, doing in these, throughout the Book of Mormon, but in particular in these so-called war chapters, is showing us how it isn't possible in many different ways for us to live as Christians in a fallen world full of hard choices. And I leave that with you in Christ's name. Amen.